we interact with this world around us, our environment, even our internal environment, two ways. The first is through bottom-up attention, and that's the more primitive, ancient type of attention that evolved really for our survival. So things in the environment that are very salient, very novel, demand our attention independent of our goals. And that's what allowed our ancient, even our primordial ancestors, even single-celled organisms of which we, evolved from, to sense the environment. Toxins and nutrients is where we started, and it has allowed us to survive. But we have another type of attention called top-down attention, where we direct our limited resources of our minds to aspects of the world that we make the decision to engage with. And this doesn't have to be the most important or the most novel elements, right? So we can reject those bottom-up, more ancient influences on our attention and impose our own goals upon it. And so this ability to have top-down control over how we process the world around us is what allowed humans to create technology and society and language and, art, music, everything is this ability to sort of break the bonds, I would say, that enslave us or enslave other animals to the environment, where they just reflexively respond to it.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Adam, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was saying before we hit record here, I kept coming across your name in virtually every book that I had read on the subject of attention and dealing with distraction. And given that this is a subject that I've dedicated a good amount of my upcoming book to, I figured it was kind of a no-brainer to have the person who's the authority on the subject matter here as a guest on Unmistakable Creative. But before we get into your work, I want to start by asking you, what did your parents do for a living? And what impact did that end up having on the choices that you've made with your life and your career?
That's a good question. So I grew up in Queens. Neither of my parents actually went to college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. They weren't all that well off when it comes to money when they grew up, and so they had to start working right after high school. My mom was a bookkeeper, or still is, for her whole career. And my dad was a engineer for the Mass Transit Authority, for the subway system, and they both still work. So they were not in the academic path that I wound up following, like science and medicine, but they really valued education, both instilled it in both myself and my sisters. And so I think that that's really the influence that they had on me, was just a strong respect for educating yourself, and also a love for science. Although they didn't engage in it professionally, my dad and my mom were both fans of it. I remember as a kid watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos, series with him, and just taking trips to the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, and just being blown away by science. And they really instilled that excitement.
How old were you when that happened?
I was around 7 or 8 when I first started getting attached and never letting go to this idea of being a scientist someday.
And how did that manifest for the rest of your childhood? Like, what kinds of things did you do in terms of extracurricular activities? Like, how did your parents encourage and nurture this interest? And what would you say to parents who are listening about this experience?
Well, it was an unusual thing for me to latch onto, given that we didn't know any scientists or doctors really growing up. And so I didn't have a real live person besides people I saw on TV that were scientists. And so, they encouraged me to, as I got a little older and was able to, travel on the subway on my own, I wound up going, well, I guess the first thing I don't know if they encouraged me, but they sort of permitted me to go to Bronx High School of Science, where I went to high school. And the reason they had to permit me was because it was a 2-hour trip each way on the subway. And, I was like 13 years old. So it was a big deal. And I wanted to go there because it was, a special school that specialized in science. And it was an opportunity for me to, step in the path that I had chosen of becoming a scientist. And the other thing I would say that they sort of encouraged or at least allowed was I would join these different societies. I joined one for astronomers. It used to meet at Carnegie Hall, and everyone there was like a full professor. I don't know how I was accepted to it. I was like a little skinny 14-year-old with a giant afro, and somehow they allowed me to be a member. And so I used to go there. I actually saw a really famous lecture by Carl Sagan back in the day, and the audience was full of, amazing writers like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. And so I got to have a meeting with those people, got to shake their hands back then. And, so I think that what, I would say to parents are to be sensitive to your children's dreams and passions, even if they seem far-fetched or unrealistic in context of where you might be at the time, and allow them to either burn out on it or take it as far as they can go.
As somebody who found this thing that you love to do at such an early age, and somebody who works in an academic institution, how do you think about education now? Because I think the thing for me, when I look back at both high school and college, and part of why I wanted to talk to you was because I remember thinking that nothing could keep my attention, particularly in college. I felt that looking back at it now, it's like, wow, I always chose things that I didn't find engaging. And you being in the academic setting, being a scientist, being somebody who focuses specifically on intention, what, if you had to design the education system of the future, what does it look like based on your research and knowledge?
Well, I have I guess a broad array of thoughts about the education system, maybe just to focus in on one of them. And this relates to the work that I do in my research center at UCSF and companies that I've started to all circle around this same area. But my observation has been that we've focused our education system largely on information content transfer. And that's really been true since the Industrial Revolution of we needed to educate people on knowledge and information that allows them to engage in the workplace. And, I think this system has evolved. There's a lot more attention to skill development. But what I don't see happening is either the assessment or the targeting of improvement of how our brain processes information, the very foundations of it. So how a young developing mind directs its attention, sustains it, switches it when they need to, how those same skills are used to regulate their emotion and their aggression, how they might feel empathy and compassion for each other or anyone in general. And those type of abilities of the mind, which we focus on in all the entities I'm a part of, are just, not part of what we tend to think of as education. And I think that is a big mistake, and that we're paying the price for that neglect now as we see attention deficits and depression and suicide anxiety rise in children and young people. So that's what that's one particular view of education. It's not meant to be all inclusive, and it's also not meant to be necessarily a replacement for everything we do now. But I feel like we can't just worry about transferring information. We need to build the underlying information processing systems of a developing mind so that it's capable of doing whatever he or she wants and without limitations in that regard.
So I'm really curious. This is something that I wanted to talk to you about. Was how does the information processing foundation of a developing mind evolve with age? Like, what happens between when we're 5 and 6, and how does it change as we become adults? Well,
the main thing that changes is that we gain more control over how we process information based on our goals. So, we interact with this world around us, our environment, even our internal environment, in two ways. The first is through bottom-up attention, and that's the more primitive, ancient type of attention that evolved really for our survival. So things in the environment that are very salient, very novel, demand our attention independent of our goals. And that's what allowed our ancient, even our primordial ancestors, even single-celled organisms of which we evolved from, to sense the environment. Toxins and nutrients is where we started, and it has allowed us to survive. But we have another type of attention called top-down attention, where we direct our limited resources of our minds to aspects of the world that we make the decision to engage with. And this doesn't have to be the most important or the most novel elements, right? So we can reject those bottom-up, more ancient influences on our attention and impose our own goals upon it. And so this ability to have top-down control over how we process the world around us is what allowed humans to create technology and society and language and, art, music, everything is this ability to sort of break the bonds, I would say, that enslave us or enslave other animals to the environment, where they just reflexively respond to it. And it's this variability of top-down attention that develops through those years that you mentioned, and it really involves how our prefrontal cortex, which is also the most evolved part of our brain, interacts with the rest of our brain to allow us to control how we process information around us.
Why is it that certain skills, like the ability to learn a musical instrument, for example, or athletic capabilities, our ability to do those things seem to diminish with time? Like, what does brain science show us about that? Why is it that it's so much easier to learn a foreign language when you're a little kid?
Well, that's mostly related to the plasticity of the brain, its ability of all of our brains to modify itself. And it does so all the time at every level that you can analyze it, from, the structure of the brain to its chemistry, to the physiology, the functional interactions between brain areas. And that plasticity is greatest earlier in life and declines. There's evidence for that. I even did some work on that as a grad student. But it doesn't go away completely. And so it is there. It's just harder to harness. And, a lot of the new technologies that we're creating are trying to have, more targeted approaches to, improving our cognition by harnessing plasticity even when we're 80 years old. But when you're younger, the brain does modify robustly in response to environment. So even though you have less top-down control, as I just described, that doesn't, that continues to really develop until our early 20s, where the brain is myelinating, and those connections are improving. But so despite the fact that as you are a child and you don't have necessarily that full control over where you want to direct your attention, your brain is very plastic and you learn rapidly. And so this is a challenge for the education systems. You have these minds which are capable of being directed and nurtured, but they don't necessarily have the ability to direct their attention anywhere they may even want to. And so this is, a really, and I think it's an evolving challenge as technology has placed a lot of pressures upon how young people like to interact with the environment. So this is a constant push and pull that teachers and educators and students will always be facing.
As some of you might know, on August 7th, my new book, An Audience of One, Reclaiming Creativity for Its Own Sake, hits bookshelves. And over the next several weeks, you'll be hearing from unmistakable creative guests who appear in the book and from other experts in their field who had a big impact on my ideas in this book. It's filled with some of the most actionable insights from former podcast guests and my own experience to help you develop a lifelong creative practice. If you found the podcast beneficial at all, one of the biggest things that you could do to support us is to pre-order the book. And you can learn more about the special pre-order bonuses that we put together at unmistakablecreative.com/audience. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/audience. One thing I didn't ask you about is what planted the seed for your interest in this particular area of brain development and neuroscience?
Well, when I was a graduate student, and I guess starting in 1992, so a long time ago now, I was presented with the opportunity to study aging brains of all sorts of older animals. And I didn't, I was 22, right? I didn't think about aging as being an interesting topic at the time. But as I started reading about it, it was something that pulled my attention, and I thought that there was something there that I could build my graduate thesis around, about how our brain ages in terms of what systems, neural systems change as we get older, even as we get older in a healthy way, independent of things like Alzheimer's disease. And so that's how I started studying the brain and aging. I still continue to study aging to this day. But over time, as the decades passed and I moved out to California, started working at Berkeley, I became interested in a very, very, when you study it, a very clear aspect of aging, which is changes in attention. And what I was observing in my data and my research was that older adults that were complaining about their memory or these senior moments, these were really attention problems, more specifically filtering problems, trying to block out irrelevant information that was getting through the filter and creating interference with what their goals were, what they were trying to remember. And so this is now over like 15 years ago when I first started making those observations. And so with that, I also realized that it was very timely because the technology world, as we all appreciate, and the amount of information in our lives was increasing. And here I was now in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where all of this was going on in terms of development, technology development. So I've always been attracted to the idea of doing research on things that were very relevant to people and also timely. And so as I was observing these attention changes in older adults in my research, and also looking at the birth of social media and all the other distracting influences, I was like, oh, this is a niche where I could focus, where there hasn't been a ton of rigorous research and understanding why our brains are susceptible to distraction, why multitasking degrades performance, and how this relates to aging and now development. So that's really what happened. I started with aging research and then moved into attention systems more recently since I've been in California.
Wow. Well, we'll start talking about all of that in quite a bit of detail, but I think I want to get there in a way that probably seems somewhat circuitous. A friend of mine, the friend that I was mentioning to you, the one who's a neurosurgery resident at Harvard, I met him for a ski trip sometime last year. And he made the observation that somehow it seemed that my attention span had improved quite a bit since we were in college. And my comment to him was, well, you have to understand, I write books for a living. Like, you can't do that if you don't learn how to sustain attention for an extended period of time. And it makes me wonder what has actually happened between now and college that could facilitate that drastic of a change. Because I can tell you, I could barely sit through a 45-minute lecture at Berkeley. I mean, I was, cute girl walks in, I'm like, okay, distracted.
Bottom up.
Friend walks by, distracted. Like, it was literally, I was counting the seconds until I could get out of there. So what happens that facilitates that kind of change? What do you think it is from a brain science perspective? What has actually gone on here?
Yeah, well, so if you were saying that was the change that occurred from preschool to college or after college, then it's what we talked about. It's right. That those abilities to not, a pretty girl walks in, that's a strong bottom up influence. Yeah. It pulls your attention. But now, once you hit college years, you have the machinery to direct your attention. It's there. Now, whether or not you do it is a different question. So if we're talking about college to now, it's a different answer, right? Because I would say now the machinery is on board, right? Yeah. It's developed. You have the capability of resisting those distractions. And I think that a lot of it is how you sort of style your own patterns of interactions with the world around you. So if you allow yourself to constantly be distracted and it reinforces itself, and you develop a sort of a habit of it where you are used to being rewarded in that way, because it is rewarding. Our brains are novelty seeking. And if you are constantly switching to new stimuli, new tasks, there's going to be a higher novelty load. And there are rewards associated with that. And so if you allow yourself to do it and never make a conscious effort, whether it's because of a career or because of a personal decision or because your spouse or your doctor or your teacher is telling you to, then that type of behavior where you're constantly switching, constantly being rewarded by the new novelty experience becomes something that perpetuates. And it's actually really hard to break that tendency. Now, if you, I imagine from what you told me, made the decision that, this is your passion. This is where you want to be successful and make your mark, and you want to write books. And as you described, when you're writing a manuscript, something of length and complexity, you need to sustain your attention to do that. You start breaking those habits and start forming the new cognitive pattern of sustained attention, singular attention to a task. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's really because you, whether consciously or not, started engaging and interacting with your environment in a different way and started feeling different types of rewards, right? So you can get rewards from doing one thing for a long time in a way that might seem impossible when you start doing it. Sort of like if you want to train for a marathon, that first day when you try to run 2 miles, it's the worst thing ever. But, 6 months later, you look back and, now 2 miles feels so good. Like that type of sustained engagement has a different type of reward structure, and it's attainable. And clearly you've been able to do that. And then that perpetuates itself.
Mm. Well, let's do this. Let's shift gears and actually talk specifically about how people optimize their own sort of environment for optimal attention and sort of peak brain performance. Like what has to be done in order for that to happen? I know some of them are probably very obvious, and also I know we talked a little bit about the way that screens have really infiltrated our lives, even our kids. So what is the impact on the brain, especially a developing brain, of having this much exposure to distracting and, novel stimuli? Because, we're probably semi-close in age, but I remember thinking, I don't remember the last time that I sat around thinking, I am bored, I have nothing to do. Like when we were kids, it was, you tell your dad you're bored, it would be like, that's great, go outside and do something.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, well, I sort of two questions there. Yeah. Maybe I'll start with the second one about, how does all of this, what I think of as interference, impact developing minds? The jury's really still out. The type of research that we need to make the strongest interpretations about what's going on are longitudinal trials that haven't really been done. And they're difficult to do for lots of reasons, not the least most because technology is changing so dramatically. I mean, if you just look at what kids are exposed to now compared to even 5 years ago, it's quite different, and it's moving dramatically. And so it's hard to do the type of long studies to see what the impact of any single new technology is, like social media, when it just keeps evolving. But what we do know is the more acute impacts. It's the chronic impacts that are hard to really tell right now. But we see that with the accessibility of information sources, young people, I'm using that term generally because it could be college students or preschool students now, are engaging in multiple information sources simultaneously. And what we know from a neuroscience perspective is that they're not really parallel processing them all. If they're attention demanding, they're switching between them. And there are costs, performance costs, that are associated with each of those switches. And so that's what we see happening if you just look in, field psychology research. And then if you look at the impact, although a lot of it is still correlational and not necessarily causal, unfortunately, because those are, again, more difficult studies, you see that that type of behavior is associated with negative consequences. It could be school performance. It could be their connectivity with each other in terms of understanding body language, and then of course the really distressing data that's coming out about its association with depression, anxiety, and even suicide. So, I think that we are rapidly trying to wrap our heads around how tools that were designed, at least with the premise of creating connectivity and interactivity between people, can lead to isolation and anxiety at a very high level. So, it's a very important area of research, because we do things frequently without a lot of thought about what the consequences are, because we just act sort of instinctually, and then we wind up apologizing frequently for mistakes that we might have made, and then try to play catch up. And I would say that's what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot to be thankful for, in my opinion, about what technology has offered us. I'm a big fan of technology. I'm not a Luddite. I use everything that everyone else has, probably more than most people.
Yeah.
But I also do recognize that, there are consequences, and we need to be thoughtful about them.
So I want to do a bit of a deeper dive into this. It's something that I've given a lot of thought to over the last year or so, particularly because of the research that I was doing for this book. And, you mentioned depression and anxiety. And, I was just writing about this the other day. Yesterday, I said, if you walked up to somebody's house and you saw what was happening through a window and made all these assumptions about them, that your assumptions would be incredibly inaccurate. But that's precisely what we do. Like, we're literally seeing everybody's lives through a window. Whatever that window be, whether it be people listening to me on the podcast, people seeing my Facebook status updates or my Instagram feed. As a scientist, how do you think about the ethical considerations that people who are building these technologies, like the Facebooks of the world and like the Googles of the world, because I know it's kind of a hot conversation right now. How do you think about that stuff?
I think that we need to be more thoughtful during the development phases of new technology. I mean, I get it as a bottom line that, I've started companies. I have a venture fund that I work with. We of course need to make profits. I am totally respecting that aspect of business, but I also think that during those critical stages where you have this great idea and you feel like it's a good business model and you have the team, you're all ready to go and you're going to start developing, I think that conversations need to happen around, is this thing that we're going to build going to enhance what makes us human in a positive way, or is it going to diminish us? And I don't think that those conversations had been taking place from my interactions with the technology world. And now there's a lot of apologizing for things that were done that maybe, and I'm not going to comment whether they were maliciously directed or just naively implemented, but I think it's imperative that we are more mature about the development process of new technologies. And as you said, it is a hot topic now, and a lot of it is trying to clean up the messes that might have been made already. But I'm more interested in establishing sort of codes, either of ethics or even legal codes to some degree, that guide our development design principles.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. Yeah, I mean, I think about it from a standpoint of I studied abroad in Brazil in 2008. This was right before smartphones became really ubiquitous. And it's funny to talk to my friends from that time period because we remember, we would have these adventures and these stories, and, we would sit at dinners for hours on end, 4 or 5 hours, just sitting, drinking, eating. And I can't for the life of me remember the last time I just sat and talked with somebody until it was last call at the bar I was at, or I was the last person in the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And my very friend says, he's like, can you imagine how different our experience would have been if we had iPhones? And aren't you glad we didn't have them during that time period?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that in all sorts of ways, like all the embarrassing things that, I've done or my friends have done as we grew up that was not captured and posted on social media, and how thankful I am and how horrified I am to imagine what it would be like being in high school when all of those moments and all those awkward phases are like posted everywhere forever. I mean, it's really so it's such a different way of interacting with the world than we experience. It's hard just experientially to wrap my head around how different that would be and how it would change your behavior, knowing that was the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always wonder, like, are we going to have a presidential candidate who we see, doing keg stands in a Facebook photo album like 20 years from now? Like, it seems kind of inevitable that we will.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
Well, let's do this. Let's start talking specifically about how we actually optimize our own sort of environment in our brain for sort of peak attention and focus. Like, how does that actually happen? And what is the impact long-term on our creativity, on our productivity? Like, where does it lead us? And one other question related to that, I'm sure you've probably read it because it definitely had a huge impact on anybody who does stuff related to attention, was Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, where he talked about the fact that these things have long-term impacts. Like he said, sometimes you're doing potentially irreversible damage when you're not taking your ability to manage your attention seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, how I always think about this from a practical point of view is sort of in a stepwise process. And to me, it begins with awareness and a deeper understanding about how your brain works and metacognition, so that you're really understanding your own behaviors and especially your own limitations in a way that gives you the motivation to start creating strategies that you interact with your technology, which is sort of what we're talking about now in a healthier way. Now, awareness is not enough. And that's been shown time and time again. Knowing healthy foods to eat, knowing about sun exposure, even knowing that cigarettes could kill you, doesn't change behavior frequently. And so just knowing all these things is not going to be enough. But I do think it is a starting point, because if you don't have this deeper understanding about why you behave in a certain way or how your influences might degrade your performance, your quality of life, it's very hard to be motivated to do something that is really challenging to do, like cutting off these influences for a period of time, allowing yourself to form new habits. And so when it comes to, awareness about it, I would say, there's several things that I try to share. And they all have in common that they're sort of an evolutionary perspective on our brains. And so the subtitle of my book is Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. And the title's The Distracted Mind. But the real underlying premise is, what are these features of our brain that have been there all along, and how we can have awareness of them that could guide us, and inform us to make better decisions. So, for example, is what we already talked about, top down and bottom up. Once you start looking at the world, like, why are you directing your attention in a certain way? Is it top down? Is it because you made a decision to do it, and that's why you are focusing on it, like your listeners might be doing right now, paying attention to this podcast? Or are you focusing on things in your environment because it's just demanding you, because it's very bright and shiny and flashing? And so seeing how top down and bottom up guides where you point your attention is a really important part of awareness. And once you start doing it, you see it all the time. So that's one thing. So, right. And the point is that bottom up, although it's a more ancient part of our attention, and although top down is part of our development, it's still there and it's still essential for survival. So it's never gone. That reflexive response to our environment is something that's really critical. The other thing that I would say, another evolutionary perspective, is that although we have this amazing ability as humans to create incredibly complicated, time-delayed goals. So I want to become a doctor. That's, when you're in high school, right? That's like a 10-year goal. But even goals that might be weeks, or I want to write a manuscript. That's like, I would say the pinnacle of the human brain is that we can create goals. We could set goals like that. But the problem is that we enact goals using our cognitive control abilities, like our attention, our working memory, our ability to switch between tasks when we want to. And those skills, cognitive control abilities, are actually very limited. And they have ancient fundamental limitations that don't even really differ very much from other animals. So although we can direct our attention, we can't distribute it broadly. We have to make decisions about where it is. We can't take in all the information around us. We can only hold so much information in mind, what we call working memory, without the fidelity, the resolution of that information degrading. And when we switch between tasks, although it often feels pretty good and it might fool you into thinking that you're more productive, there is a degradation of that information every time you switch. And so realizing these limitations in a deep way and recognizing them, I think, is really key. So that when you have that goal, you realize, okay, having the goal is not enough. I also have to get over the hurdle that my brain is not going to allow me to accomplish this just the way I might imagine it ideally. And so those are a couple of sort of perspectives about, the ancient aspects of our brain that I think is a starting point for then being healthier in how you interact with the world.
Mm-hmm. How do you develop the ability to sustain attention over an extended period of time? Because I know from speaking with Stephen Kotler and many other people that, to get to sort of a flow state in which, you write words, or even, the surfer, like there is a sort of time delay between when you start and when you get into that state in which you kind of finally start to experience sort of the, real joys of being deeply focused on something. But if you're, the person who constantly task switches, the idea of sustaining attention for even an hour, I know because I talk to people, and when I try to tell them one focused hour a day can, produce exponential results, I'm amazed by how difficult people find that. It just baffles me that an hour seems like such a long time for somebody to focus on a task.
Yeah. So, so starting with an awareness of those limitations, and then one last awareness that people probably already know about is that when you try to do what you just described, to sustain your attention on a single task, you're going to feel the accumulation of two things. Likely. One is anxiety, and that anxiety could manifest in all sorts of formats, like the famous FOMO, that you're missing out on something else. And of course, social media has a strong influence on creating that, especially in young people. But the other is performance anxiety, like what am I not doing that I also need to get done that's on my to-do list, and maybe I should start working on that. So anxiety accumulates. The other thing that accumulates is boredom. Again, the novelty is getting less every moment that you spend on that single task. It might have been novel when you first opened up that Word document, but 10 minutes later, it's just not novel anymore. And there's something very novel that's literally just a click away or in your pocket. And so I feel like it's really important to start being introspective and allow yourself to just feel that anxiety and that boredom like wash onto you, and just accept it and just take it. And you're not going to die from it, right? It's completely safe to feel those sensations for a while and recognize that that's what they are. And that you don't have to reflexively try to eliminate them by filling in those gaps that exist in information, right? So you could get rid of your anxiety just by checking out what someone else is doing, or switching over to your email that you haven't answered while you're writing this article, or you could get rid of your boredom by going on Facebook. But if you just stick with it and try to understand why you're making these responses, that's a really big start. Now, the practicality is you can't do that for an hour if you're not trained to do it. It's just like everything else, you need to develop the skills to be able to accomplish something. And the tricky part is that you feel like it should be easy because we grew up focusing for an hour. And now you might be in a style where that's something you do very rarely, but you think like, oh, I know how to do that. The practical way that I went about it when I first challenged myself with this goal of being able to focus for an hour, because I've done that, is to baby step into it, to first eliminate all of the sources of distraction, quitting so if I'm writing an article, let's take that as an example, I'll quit my email program. I'll turn my phone to airplane mode. I'll shut my door. Maybe the only other source of interference I'll accept is music. And we can talk about music.
I do want to talk about that.
Yeah, we could come back to that. So, and then I'm working right now. I might say I'm going to do this for 10 minutes and then I'm going to take a break for 30 seconds and then I'm going to do it again. Sort of like the gym, the interval training approach of, taking a break to restore and then re-engage. But the key part here in my experience is that if that break is to go back on your email
right.
or to go into Facebook or Twitter, you are lost. You are not getting back very quickly because those are just like these sinkholes that will just pull you away from your original goal. So the break that I'll take is, I'll do like push-ups in my office or look out the window at nature or put on even a screensaver of nature or do some or close my eyes and do some meditative breathing. Not for all that long, and then get back into it. And then what I have found is that those 10 minutes where I could work in a sustained way and then take, a 30-minute break now is 20 minutes, 30 minutes where I just need a break in the middle. Sometimes I'll be like, oops, I forgot to take my break. And, I was able to do it a solid hour. And so it's just like preparing for anything. You gradually bring on more and more sustained attention time.
Mm-hmm. What happens neurologically when you shift to something like a Facebook? I know that Cal and many other people have talked about attention residue, and I given your background, I'd love to hear actually what is happening neurologically in the process of attention residue.
Well, we have some papers that show that using functional MRI when you're in the scanner and you have a goal like to remember a face, which is something that we do all the time. And then in the middle of that, we insert another task. You have to identify, this picture, this scene. What we see is that the brain networks that involve the prefrontal cortex and the visual cortex, that's how you maintain that information over time, essentially is broken. And a new network for the second task is re-engaged, and then that is broken, and then that original network is re-engaged. You sort of see this network switching we've been able to show. And it's that switch. Not everyone switches back as efficiently as everyone else. We know that as we get older, our ability to switch back is delayed and takes longer. And, our data would suggest that it's, and others as well, that it's with these switches that some of that original, information that was being captured is lost. And sometimes these are just time delays, but we see it present as performance decrements that occur as opposed to if you just held your attention for the entire time.
Hey, it's Srini. I wanted to remind you again about our first live taping of The Unmistakable Creative on Thursday, August 9th in New York City at 7 p.m., where I'll be interviewing former Unmistakable Creative guest Sarah Peck. I know some of you already bought tickets, and we are going to limit the number of tickets to make sure that it is as intimate an experience as possible. So to get your ticket, just visit unmistakablecreative.com/live. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/live, and we look forward to meeting you in person. So one question I have is around schedules. The reason this is interesting to me is because I'm religious about protecting my mornings, mainly because I know that between 6 and 9 a.m. are literally the time when I get the most writing done, the most reading done. And I, like you said, I want to come back to the music thing because I actually, I'll meditate for 10 minutes and then I will turn on a techno track on repeat and I'll go put my phone out of the room, but I want the headphones. Why do we see what we do in the morning? Like, what impact does time of day have on the brain's capacity for attention, I guess is really what I'm getting at.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of interesting work on circadian rhythms. Actually, the data would suggest that older adults often do better in the morning. But I think that the message that I'd like to give here is that everyone has their own ideal way of interacting with their goals and accomplishing them. And it's important to, again, back to that idea of being introspective, understanding yourself, and then making decisions based upon that. So I'm more in favor of just, instead of being overly prescriptive, like this is what you should do, spend the first 3 hours of your day working on something that's most important. I think it's more important for someone to observe themselves when they're at that peak performance, what time of the day, how it relates to when they get their physical exercise, when they eat their meals, do they drink coffee? All these things are so different between every single person. And then schedule. And I agree with what you said. Like I schedule things that other people don't, or I don't see people doing as frequently. Like on my calendar right now, if I take a glance at it, I could see every day there's a schedule for when I go to the gym. If I don't put that there, I know my assistant will fill every single block with calls and meetings, and it's important for me to still do physical exercise. I'll schedule an hour for single tasking. So and I have that right after we get off this call for an hour. So I am working on a piece right now that I'm going to publish in the next couple weeks. And that type of thing gets eaten up by everything else all the time. And so I'll protect that hour from 11 to noon where I will, again, shut everything off because I am just as distractible by those sources as everyone else, and just focus for that hour. And, I might take 15-minute breaks as I get through that hour. So I think that it's not that multitasking or being distracted is bad. It's not bad or good. There's no morality here. It's just that if you are informed about how your brain works, you can understand that there is going to be a cost that you pay if you're switching all the time. And sometimes maybe that's fine. Maybe scheduling an hour to just multitask because you're doing a bunch of low-level things that don't have time pressure. They don't have like a quality stamp that needs to be associated with it. And they're boring. And so it's a lot more fun to do that. But then, you realize that this is the type of thing that needs singular attention. And so I'm going to put it on my calendar. I'm going to protect that time and block out all the other sources that will derail me.
A couple of other questions around this. One, what impact does distracting technology like social media and all this other stuff, that we tend to do when we're not trying to focus? How does that? So I'll frame it with a practical example for context. So let's say that I get done, and I've noticed this as a pattern, but I've never had the science to necessarily back it up. If I spend an evening after a certain time of night, like 6 o'clock or whatever, and I'm checking Facebook, clicking on links, swiping on dating apps, whatever, uploading pictures to Instagram, I notice a pretty severe degradation in performance the next morning. And I remember Cal talking about this and saying, he said, people have this tendency when they're standing in line at the grocery store, whatever it is, to reach for their phones and look at something. And he said, what you don't realize is that actually affects your ability to focus when you try to sit down and focus. So like what you're doing when you're not trying to focus matters just as much.
Yeah. I haven't studied that myself. That sort of, the residual effects, I guess what you're saying, of interacting like that. I feel like our brains are pretty dynamic, and I'm able to go in the gym, focus in a certain way, and then switch dramatically to a big giant board meeting that's an incredibly different environment than I was in before. Go back, sit in silence for an hour and write, and then move into a big lunch meeting. I think that we are really capable of a lot of switching between blocks of activities if we train ourselves for it. In terms of, but there are also residual effects on, related to emotion and stress for sure. So if you do something that is anxiety provoking, so you're on, let's say you're a 12-year-old that's feeling already that you're not maybe fitting in the optimal way that you wish you were. And then you go on Instagram and you see every one of your friends are having a great time right now, and somehow you weren't invited to that. That's going to have a residual effect. There's no doubt. So, and same thing with stress. So anxiety, stress, depression, all of these impacts that what could feel like very trivial behaviors, like just going on social media, could certainly have ramifications over long periods of time. And then just the last thing I'd like to say is the impact on sleep, right? So we have acquired so much important information from research about the benefits of not just the hours of sleep, but the quality of sleep on all aspects of our physiology and health, especially on our brain. I mean, it's where we consolidate memories. It allows the restoration of our attentional systems. And so if your activities at night are displacing sleep, which happens a lot, the data on younger people are just like mind-blowing. How many kids are sleeping with their devices under their pillows so that they could feel the vibration of a text coming in or a post. And it's just like dizzying to imagine how that type of disruption when you're young and your brain is developing might have consequences beyond even the ones that it's clearly going to have on your next day. We're complex systems, and we're interacting with a complex environment that is changing dramatically all the time in a way that's rather uncontrolled. And so we're constantly trying to understand all of these moving pieces, and sleep and technology's impact on it is an example of one that I think was overlooked, but now it's quite clear that it's really important.
I want to go back to talking about music because I know you alluded to it earlier. That I've noticed that because a big difference for me, and it turns out that I'm not alone. Like when I asked people about this for research for the book, I remember Stephen Kotler, same thing. Same techno track on repeat every day, every morning for like 3 hours. Ryan Holiday, same thing. Why is that? What is happening in the brain, and how does music help us with this idea of sustaining attention?
Yeah, so technically, if you just strip away all of the nuances of what music does, you would say it's an interference. It's going to degrade performance, just like any source of information that is not the focus of your goals will degrade performance. We see that all the time. Just having visual information around you, having your eyes open when you're trying to remember something diminishes your performance. We have a paper that shows that, including neural data. Even just having your ears open in just the normal environmental sounds of like being in a restaurant diminishes your memory performance. So we are very susceptible to a negative impact of interference. So technically, music should fall into that category. And when I think I have to look at this study again, so I don't want to quote it in detail, but that if you look at like non-human primates, like monkeys, you see the negative impacts of music on their performance. And you see it in people too. So and I don't study this directly, but from reading about it, what I have interpreted the data to show is that it really matters what music you're listening to. So music can have an effect that overrides its interference, its negative impact on your performance due to arousal effects and also, pushing on emotions and stress levels. And I think that's sort of how you're describing. You listen to techno music, yeah. It has a very, very fast beat. It drives up your adrenaline and alters your state, right? It's a state-altering event, which could have all types of positive consequences. But if you have someone listen to music they don't like while they're trying to accomplish something else, it's an interference. It's a negative effect, and those studies have been done. So if you get to choose the music that you've already determined works for you, then it's possible that it could have positive benefits through its influence on arousal, mood, and stress.
Interesting. It's funny because when I was younger, I would try to use classical music to study, but having been a musician, having been in the band, when I would listen to classical music, my mind would start to wander because I would start thinking about, fingerings on, valves on my instrument. And like I would think about what the tuba part would be in this piece that I'm listening to. So it didn't work. And so techno music, I think it's exactly an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are thinking about their own experience with music right now. And, I know this because a lot of people have expressed it to me, is that there'll be certain music they listen to when they do certain activities. So, for example, I find it very hard. I don't know about you, but when I'm writing, to listen to lyrics in music,
absolutely,
it's right. So it makes sense from a neuro point of view because they're in the same modality, right?
Exactly.
You're expressing language. Language is coming in. It's much. I have a soundtrack that is all non-lyric music that I found on Spotify that I like. That has the right type of tempo that works for me when I'm writing. And that's what I listen to. That's what I'll listen to in the next hour when I'm trying to write this piece. But, there are other times where lyrics are really beneficial. So that's sort of, again, the personalizing your environment, given your experiences and your goals is critical.
Yeah. So we got about 5 minutes left, and I know we probably won't be able to cover this in the depth that I'd like to get into it. What has your research shown about cognitive enhancement supplements, things like modafinil, things like the supplements that we see, as well as, I know that microdosing is now becoming quite common for people. My own experience with microdosing mushrooms has shown me that, wow, this is amazing in terms of what it's done for attention.
Yeah, well, this is a giant conversation.
We have to bring you back. We have to bring you back for a second round.
Yeah, sometimes I'll do an entire hour podcast just devoted to this, and nothing else that we've already talked about.
Well, then we'll have to bring you back for this.
Sounds good. Yeah, this is an area that's very dear to my heart. It's actually what I work on now. I study distraction, multitasking, interference effects, the things that we have been covering for over a decade, but over the last 6 years, I've really switched and pivoted my entire research program to not studying the negative impacts of interference, but to develop new approaches to enhancing cognition. And there's a long list of things, including things that you can ingest that may have benefits that we use to treat clinical conditions like modafinil, Adderall, or Aricept, and other drugs that we're beginning to explore once again, like psychedelics, psilocybin, and others that are all fascinating and the topic of long conversation. The area that I focus on in my own research and with companies that I've started is to do a complete flip on the technology story as we've been discussing it. Okay, technology places a burden on our brains because of these ancient aspects of how we function. That's an important context to develop new technology. Like you want to place it in that framework. But now, how do we create new technologies that are targeted and personalized and adaptive to us, that challenge us appropriately with the type of experience that can allow us to develop in a positive way, that can improve our attention and our emotional regulation and our empathy and compassion, all of those things. And so that's essentially how I spend my entire life, is thinking about how we create closed loop video games and virtual reality, augmented reality, motion capture. How do we use machine learning and artificial intelligence? All of these technologies that are largely in the entertainment and media domain. How do we think about them as cognitive enhancement tools? And that's what we develop, and that's what we research.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to bring you back to discuss all of that, because, like I said, I had a feeling I was like, this is potentially a landmine that we couldn't cover in 5 minutes.
Yeah, there's a lot on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been truly amazing. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights with the listeners. I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Something that makes someone unmistakable?
Or something unmistakable?
I would say, it's maybe an obvious one, but, your own unique sort of style. How do you express yourself in a way that captures what you're passionate about and excited about, and not burying it, but putting it right out there that everyone sees it.
Amazing. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and your books?
Yeah, so I have several different sources. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I have a website for our research center called neuroscape.ucsf.edu. And in the next 2 weeks, I'll have a website, Gazzaley.com, where I'll aggregate all these different things in my life, all my podcasts that I've done and talks and research publications and companies all in one place. So that'll be coming really soon.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we'll wrap the show with that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.